Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. and our continuing discussion of American cultural history. Our focus throughout this course will be on American culture primarily in the 20th century, or at least after the years of the Gilded Age that followed the Civil War. But in this series of preliminary lectures, we're going to provide some background and context to culture in those later years by examining American culture from the beginning up to the Civil War. As I mentioned at the end of the previous lecture, culture has always existed throughout human history, and that was certainly true in early American history. Recall that culture, while a complex concept, is described as the totality of ideas in a society, including thoughts, feelings, customs, pastimes, and stories. So of course, early settlers and early Americans had all those things. But compared to more recent times, there were relatively few ways for those ideas to have expression, especially in a form leaving evidence and sources for future scholars to ponder. So in this lecture, I'm going to go over a quick review of culture in America prior to the Civil War era. And then next time, we'll start to settle in with more detailed discussions of culture in the years after the Civil War and the Gilded Age. I should also mention, as a disclaimer from the outset, that in this lecture and throughout the rest of the course, it's impossible to mention and describe every example of culture in any given era. If cultural history is a history of ideas, then there are infinite examples from every era that could be discussed, but that would literally take forever. So throughout this course, we'll have to accept some limitations and live with a relatively small sample of examples representing bigger themes from each period. As I mentioned in class last time, cultural history prior to the Civil War can sometimes be difficult to trace, since both the methods of and interest in recording human activities were more limited in that era. We have no photography, no audio recordings, no video recordings, no movies, television, or radio. Written documents themselves can be scarce. Many older documents have been lost or destroyed. Some may have been considered unimportant at some point along the way and discarded. Some have been intentionally destroyed or lost in fires. Consider the example of early boxing matches between slaves and staged by slave owners. These were not uncommon, but how do we learn about such events? We have no video recordings. Who would have written about them? The slaves themselves were almost always illiterate, although we do have a few slave narratives providing some clues. The news media typically would not have reported on such things as they weren't newsworthy. And the accounts of slave owners are problematic. They probably wouldn't have written much about them. Their accounts would have been hopelessly biased, and those records have a slim chance of surviving through today. So scholars attempting to write about slave boxing matches face great hurdles in finding sources. And that's just one example. Recognizing that the evidence may be scarce, scholars nonetheless put together a picture of culture in early America. Your textbook author, Eric Avila, describes the development of a European identity in the 15th and 16th centuries as European nations engaged in exploring the rest of the world, including the New World of the Americas. Under this mindset, Europeans came to view themselves as superior in terms of government, knowledge, and culture. All other societies were inferior and came to be viewed as the other, with primitive cultures and societies. Even when confronted with a nation such as China, which clearly had a more sophisticated understanding of many natural phenomena and had developed superior technologies in many ways, Europeans could only see themselves as superior. The artwork of the day reflected this Eurocentric worldview. The engravings of Flemish artist Theodore de Bry, for instance, convey the message that Europeans are superior. In his images, a couple of which you see pictured here, the native peoples are naked. They engage in barbarism, such as violence, murder, and cannibalism. The Europeans, in contrast, are well dressed, bring with them many sophisticated devices and weapons, and are in control of the situation. These images, widely viewed in Europe, furthered their belief in European superiority and in turn the inferiority of the other. This worldview carried through all the encounters of the colonial age, and Europeans developed an ideology that they were righteous and noble, carrying with them the right ideas and religious beliefs. They were helping other populations by introducing them to European methods of government and especially Christianity. Missionary zeal, the drive to Christianize and Europeanize quote-unquote heathen peoples, carries through even into the 20th century, as Americans carried their beliefs to far-flung parts of the world, like Asia, Africa, and South America. While some missionaries, especially those in the 20th century and beyond, introduced their beliefs carefully and with respect to native customs, in many cases, especially in the period of discovery and colonization, their methods were more harsh, destroying native symbols or sites, displacing the natives from their homes and homelands, and forcing them to adopt European religion and cultural ways. In reality, the populations that Europeans encountered and in turn conquered, displaced, or killed by disease or warfare were actually rich and diverse in their own right. Native Americans utilized nature in ways Europeans could not conceive, and the Columbian exchange of ideas, goods, and even diseases was a two-way street. Native American methods of farming, making canoes and tools, and utilizing herbs and natural remedies were adopted by many Europeans settling in the New World, particularly French fur traders, who typically lived alone or in small numbers in the wilderness and relied on Native American methods for survival. These traders frequently engaged in relations with Native American women, often marrying them, and thus integrated their own cultures with those of the Native Americans. In other cases, such as the Incas and Aztecs, Native American populations developed large cities, architectural and building techniques to rival the Europeans, and sophisticated trade networks. Similarly, their religious beliefs and customs, while different from Europeans, were based on similar methods of observing natural phenomenon, the weather and the stars, and developing myths and stories based on those observations. The Europeans did not encounter inferior cultures in the New World, but they were different. But European belief in their own superiority became a key feature of the clash of cultures in the New World, which was waged for several centuries after the initial period of discovery and exploration. Images and descriptions of Native Americans appear frequently in the art and literature of the age. Even William Shakespeare offered a thinly veiled commentary on European colonialism and the New World in his 1610 play The Tempest. While scholars fiercely debate Shakespeare's intentions when he wrote the play, it is clearly driven by the colonial moment, as the play is set on a faraway island and involves the relationship between the colonizers and the colonized, slaveholders and slaves. Artists, cartoonists, and engravers in the colonial and revolutionary periods often used Native Americans to symbolize various ideas: simplicity, innocence, primitiveness, savagery, or helplessness. Notice that they are never used to symbolize sophistication, knowledge, or superiority. Colonists and early Americans also took to quote-unquote playing Indian as a symbol of going back to more primitive or simple ways. Sometimes, playing Indian rendered the Native Americans a position of righteousness. The Sons of Liberty, when they stormed 3 ships in Boston Harbor in 1773 and dumped their contents, British tea, into the sea, dressed as Mohawk Indians and delivered war whoops during the raid. The costumes served several purposes, both subtle and overt. For one, they helped to disguise the perpetrators, so they would be harder to catch. But the symbolism of the Native American conveyed its own messages. On the one hand, the fierce warrior who would be difficult to subdue. On the other hand, the righteous victim, being unfairly treated by power holders from a faraway land. In this story, It is the Native Americans who are justified and, in fact, heroic in their actions. In our next lecture, we'll examine some of the culture present in the slavery society in early America.